All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about something pretty major happening in the U.S. economy, something you might not have expected. The government, it's starting to act a whole lot like a big-time investor.
And really, it all kicks off with a question that might make you do a double take. I mean, think about it. The U.S. government, which has always been the poster child for free markets, now owns a piece of Intel. Yeah, that Intel. And this isn't some kind of fluke or a one-time thing. Nope. It's pointing to a much, much bigger story about how the relationship between Washington, D.C. and the world of high finance is changing. So let's get into it. For the longest time, the idea of the U.S. government actually owning pieces of private companies, that was pretty much off the table. Unthinkable, right? But something's shifted. Lately, Uncle Sam has been acting a lot like a venture capitalist. Those investors who pour cash into promising startups hoping for a big payoff. Well, that's what's happening now, but with taxpayer money going straight into some really major companies.
And the biggest example, the one that really got everyone talking, is Intel. The government basically took its loans and grants and turned them into a 9.9% piece of the company. Now, this is important. This isn't like the 2008 bailouts. This was framed as a strategic investment, and you better believe it raised a lot of eyebrows.
But it's not just Intel, not by a long shot. The government also grabbed a 15% stake in a company called MP Materials. They make these supercritical rare earth magnets. Then you've got deals where the government gets a 15% cut of chip sales to China from heavy hitters like Nvidia and AMD. And now there's even talk about taking stakes in huge defense firms like Lockheed Martin. The companies whose main customer is, wait for it, the government. Kind of circular, right?
So when you start connecting all these dots, Intel, MP Materials, the chip deals, well, the experts are starting to put a name on it. They're calling it an accidental sovereign wealth fund, or a de facto one. And that, of course, leads us to a really big question.
What in the world is a sovereign wealth fund anyway? It's a phrase that gets tossed around, but what does it actually mean? Because to really get what's happening in the U.S., we've got to take a step back and see how the rest of the world does this.
Okay, so putting it simply, it's basically a giant investment fund that's owned by a country. Instead of the government just, collecting taxes and spending money on roads and services, it acts like a massive investment company. It buys up stocks, bonds, real estate, all sorts of assets, all over the world, with the goal of making more money for the nation.
And here's the thing. These are super common. The U.S. has always been the exception, kind of steering clear of this whole idea. But more than 100 other countries have their own sovereign wealth fund, or SWF for short.
And the amount of money we're talking about, it's just mind-boggling. All told, these funds around the world manage more than $10 trillion. Let that sink in. $10 trillion. That is a staggering amount of financial power controlled directly by governments.
And just look at this chart to see who the heavy hitters are. You've got countries like Norway, who took their oil money and built this absolutely colossal fund. They're a global financial giant. Then there's China and Saudi Arabia, also controlling these massive war chests of cash, which, as you can imagine, gives them a ton of influence on the world stage.
Okay, so that brings us right back home, to the USA. Why? Why is the American government, which has always been so cautious, so skeptical about getting its hands dirty in the market, suddenly jumping into the game?
Well, the main argument you'll hear, and this is coming straight from folks in the White House, is that it's all about protecting the taxpayer. The thinking goes something like this. If we're using your money, taxpayer money, to support these really important companies, then you, the public, should get a piece of the action if they succeed. Makes sense on the surface.
So, the key here is how this is all being framed. It's being sold as two things. First, being smart with money, and second, national security. On the one hand, the government wants to make back the billions it's spending on things like the CHIPS Act, but honestly, the bigger piece of the puzzle is making sure America can stand on its own 2 feet when it comes to critical tech, like semiconductors, and that our military has everything it needs, especially now, with all the global tensions out there.
So, if we want to guess where this whole accidental American fund might be going, it's a really good idea to look at how other countries do it, the ones who've been in this game for a while.
And this table really breaks down the different flavors. You've got Norway using its oil wealth to basically create a giant savings account for its grandkids. And there's Saudi Arabia also using oil money, but sometimes for these wild political projects like that 100-mile-long city in the desert.
Singapore is often held up as the gold standard. They run their fund like a top-tier independent business. And then there's the US model, and it's the real oddball here because it's not being funded by extra cash, it's being funded by debt. And the whole point is to protect key industries.
But as you've probably already guessed, not everyone is thrilled about this new direction for the US. Not at all. In fact, a lot of experts are waving some pretty big red flags, saying, hey, wait a minute, this road could be full of potholes.
And this quote from finance professor Bill Megginson just nails the feeling of anxiety perfectly. He calls it a very bad idea whose time may have come. Think about that. He's basically saying, look, this might be inevitable, but that doesn't make it a good thing. It's still a bad idea.
And the concerns really boil down to a few big things. First up, politics. Is the government going to start picking winners and losers based on political favors instead of, good business sense? Then there's transparency, or the lack of it. Most of these funds operate like black boxes. And then you have to look at the government's track record as an investor, which is, let's be honest, not exactly stellar. And the big one, how in the world do you pay for all this when you're already deep in debt?
So all of this makes the critics wonder, what's the real endgame here? Is this truly about national security, or is it a backdoor for the government to get more political control over the economy?
So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that we are right in the middle of a huge debate, a really fundamental one about what the government's job should be in the U.S. economy. We're not just talking about a few stock purchases here, we're talking about the future of American capitalism as we know it.
You've got two camps, really. On one side, people are saying, look, this is a tool we have to use. In a world where we're competing with powerful nations, the government has to step in to protect our most important industries. But the other side is pushing back hard, warning that this is a dangerous path, a slippery slope to the government controlling way too much of the economy, which could actually kill the innovation we're trying to save.
And that really leaves us with the million-dollar question, doesn't it? Are we witnessing the start of a new, smarter era for American industry, or are we watching the economy get tangled up in politics in a really dangerous way? There is no simple answer here, but you can be sure that the path the U.S. chooses now is going to define our economy for generations. And that's our explainer for today.